be on test number 3. Okay, and that is, now of course, those of you that cell with me, it's going to be a review and expansion. It's like taking biochemistry first semester after taking cell with me. I've heard there's a lot of overlap, and it just adds on to what you've already learned and stuff. Okay.
So in extra long, we learn more about long learn coding where you talking about with the new material.
Oh, what was that?
The long learn coding. Are you talking about the new material?
No, I'm talking about the new material now. In other words, we're going to be looking at cell signaling now, where you start that off. Because one thing in a multicellular organism, cells have to communicate with each other. And they have to regulate their activities. I'm going to give you an analogy of take a look at a society. Everybody, the biological behavioral tendency is, once again, maximize your reproductive success. If you happen to be an individual, a guy for instance, what you want to do is basically vet as many ladies as possible, right? And leave them perhaps with most of the child care. And you can see that all the time around here in this state, So that's one kind of thing. If you're a female, you want to select the best males possible, ones that seem to have the best genes, the biggest, the strongest, the most powerful, the ones that seem to have weathered through disease and are able to forage and get through food and stuff like that. But in a sense, everybody's out to maximize the reproductive success. Now, you start joining people together in larger societies, and then you have, and this is a hot issue in evolutionary biology, the evolution of altruism. In other words, to get a society to function, whether it's a tribe or a nation or what have you, people have to put restraints on their behavior for the good of the whole. My next door neighbor has all kinds of nice stuff in her house. I might actually like that, but I'm not going to go in and break into her house and steal stuff, okay?
Well, that depends on
Nor am I going to shoot my colleagues in department meeting. That actually has been known to happen in some institutions.
Yeah, a good thing.
Nor am I going to chase after 14-year-olds on the internet. That's happens in some institutions too. Okay, yeah. Well, we heard some interesting.
a lot of people here.
Yeah. Well, you heard some interesting tales. This university had some interesting tales the past year or so. Okay, but at any rate, okay, well, but for society to function, you have to have some kind of constraints on people's behaviors for the good of the society. For instance, I'm paying taxes all the time, right? I would rather have a larger paycheck, but on the other hand, some of those taxes, at least some of them, go to things that might be useful, like providing salaries for instructors, providing financial aid for you guys, providing research money, some other things like providing for getting into wars that we don't belong, and I may have differences of opinion on that, but we're giving up some of our hard-earned money to the federal government or the state government or what have you, and that does various kinds of things that are supposedly out to benefit us all, whether it's the roads or research money or whatever the case, Social Security, whatever the case happens to be. And we don't do certain things like steal, most of us at least, like break into your neighbor's houses and steal stuff, or kill people, or what have you. And
You don't have that outside, you don't know us.
okay, well, I'll find out if you guys do bad on the exam, right?
Just saying.
Okay, but, in the absence of all these kinds of things, society would fall apart. If you want good examples of that, take a look at Somalia. It's a really good example of society that has disintegrated into small warring factions. Take a look at what's going on in Chad right now. The French are in a big way in this case. Or Afghanistan even, we're in a big way. But, former societies, former nations fragmenting into sort of tribal things are constantly at war with each other. Okay, that happens. Societies can break down if these different rules and regulations aren't followed. Now, how does that happen in this society? How do we get these things? What are these rules and regulations? Well, of course, you've got things like laws. if I don't pay my taxes or I cheat on my taxes and I get caught at it, I'm going to get fined, penalty, I have to pay the taxes, I'll get penalty charges. If I do something really nasty, I could even be prosecuted and sent to jail. Now, I don't have, well, I could, yeah, I couldn't possibly owe enough taxes for them to throw me in the joint. So I'm probably safe on that, but I could get hefty fines. Okay, and you know, if I do actually go in and break in my neighbor's house and steal stuff, I could end up going to jail for that or facing the wrong end of a 12 gauge. Whatever the case is. So there are certain things that deter me from doing certain nasty kinds of behaviors. And then there's various religious and moral codes and stuff that are found in all kinds of cultures. You know, one of the big problems we have politically in this country is different people have different codes, especially about controversial issues like sex, abortion, and things like that. Even within the faith, there's a lot of very different opinions on that. And that's where you get these kinds of clashes that dominate our political system for a while. But every society has to have some kind of rules that are followed in order for the whole society to function properly. And over time, we've gone from sort of like the extended families / small tribal level of organization to larger tribes, and then finally to small nations or states, and finally to the national level. And once in a while, even joining together at a more global level, like case in point about a worldwide ban on the production of fluorocarbons, because the evidence was clear that these things were destroying the ozone layer. And one of the few times the world actually got together, we're all going to stop producing this stuff because the consequences will affect us all. And the ozone holes have been getting a little bit better. It's going to take decades for them to go back to normal. But saw some computer models that NASA put out. What would happen if we kept business as usual? By the end of the 21st century, the ozone layer would be virtually gone over the poles and almost gone even over the temperate and equatorial regions. It would completely destroy it if we kept business as usual. So, yeah, so in that case, the whole world rallied behind a common threat and actually agreed on something. That's very rare, by the way, but it happens once in a while. So, when you look at an organism, organisms have to do the same kind of thing that societies do. They have to have things that regulate the behavior of the cells within that organism. One of the big things is regulating the cell division rate. Most cells in the human body, if you take most cells out, put them in a culture dish with the appropriate culture media and all the other growth factors, all the goodies that you need to get cell growth and culture. Most of the cells will divide once every 24 to 48 hours. That's typical for human and mammalian cells in culture. Yet in the organism, those cells may divide once a year. Many times they will only divide under certain circumstances, like to repair damaged tissue or something like that. Now, for instance, the cells in the dermis of my skin, underneath the outer epidermis, those cells proliferate fairly slowly, and then some of those cells differentiate into the highly keratin-rich outer layers of the skin, and eventually those cells die and you have nothing left. The outer skin, the outer epidermis, is basically just dead cells, and it's a bunch of very tough keratin filaments. But the cell itself is long dead. Now, if I were to take out my pocket knife and gouge a divot out of my arm, which I will not do, I do not like the sight of blood, especially my own, and I do not like pain either, especially my own. But if I were to do that and generate a wound, what would happen? Those cells at the edge of the wound would notice, in effect, that there's no cells that they're next to. That would cause them to start proliferating. They would proliferate to fill in that gap that was just there. They would start to differentiate back into the layers of the skin that I had gouged out if I would do something like that. And then they would stop growing. They might overgrow a little bit, leading to a scar, but generally they will stop at a certain point. That's good. So, in this case, we're seeing cells that ordinarily divide relatively infrequently, dividing as rapidly as they can to fill up a wound, a damaged area of tissue, and then differentiating, and then stop dividing. Very impressive. The liver has a tremendous capacity to regenerate. If you took half of your liver out, like give a liver transplant to somebody, within several months it would grow back. Now, if you figure your liver can double in size within several months, imagine what would happen if that process continued. Pretty soon you would be all liver. It would look like a shark or something. You ever seen the size of livers in sharks? They're huge. Okay, yeah, anybody to compare it with a bird. Okay, so in other words, those cells could rapidly overgrow to the point it would be detrimental to the rest of the organs. So we see that. Now, of course, what is cancer? Cancer is when certain cell types start proliferating without those restraints. Using the society as an analogy, it's like the people that break the rules. The rules that you're not supposed to go and kill somebody just because you don't like them. Okay, well, those are broken. Think of that LA cop, right? He's a cop. He's supposed to enforce the law, not go kill people, but he did. And I guess I was surprised they actually got him as quickly as they did because he knew what he was doing and he knew how they worked and stuff. But, you know, had he unchecked, he might have killed scores of people. Who knows? But, you know, you occasionally get rogue people in a society just like you get rogue cells. So that's one kind of thing. Regulating the proliferation rate. Failure to do so is what we call cancer. And there's a whole bunch of different causes for that, obviously. Now, second thing, cells often tell each other what to do, what to differentiate into, what kinds of things, what kinds of genes to express or to stop expressing. You know, once in a while, I'm going to get a directive either from my department head or through him from administration of, you have to now do this, generally filling out some more useless paperwork, okay? They love that kind of stuff. It's food for them. They eat and digest cellulose, okay? They have the enzymes to do that. Okay, well, at any rate, you know, we get directives, we get things that we have to follow, otherwise we're going to get in mild to serious trouble depending on what it is. Okay, so somebody, generally higher up, is telling us what to do. Yes, now we have to, you know, fill out these forms, or we have to do something about these classes, or maybe as a department we have to offer certain classes that we hadn't offered before, or some of you, were any of you folks in, what was it, senior seminar in May last year? Oh, okay. The education department needed for their people us to offer senior seminar, and it was never been done outside a regular semester, so Dr. Romano asked me whether I'd be willing to try it. I said, yeah. I said, I feel sorry for those students. It's a lot of work to do in one semester. It worked, and it had never been done before, but you know, that in that case was at the request of another department. So, in a sense, I was altering my behavior, teaching a class that I had never taught in fact, nobody ever taught it in the May session before, and trying to get it to work, and it actually did work that time. I was pleasantly surprised, I'd say. Still feel sorry for students. Putting together a 20-page paper in 3 weeks and the presentation is not easy, but most of them rose to the occasion quite nicely. Okay, so that kind of stuff. Likewise with cells, cells can communicate with each other and alter their behavior in one way or another. It may stimulate cell movement, cell migration. It may stimulate changes in gene expression. Many times, cells will send some kind of information to target cells, telling them to do something, telling them to migrate somewhere, telling them to stop migrating somewhere, telling them to change their gene expression, leading to differentiation. And then often when we have these kind of back and forth communication cycles, cell A tells cell B to do something. Cell B does it, and then it tells cell A to do something. And it goes back and forth, and both cells differentiate in different ways. That happens a lot of times in development. And that often leads to formation of first tissues, differentiation to more specialized kind of tissues, and then integration to form organs. A lot of our organs, which often consist of different cell types, like the endothelial cells in your digestive tract, surrounded by mesodermal cells, connective tissue, smooth muscle, stuff like that. Those cells, when those organs were being formed, were constantly communicating with each other, each telling each other what to turn into, how to differentiate. And then they do that and tell the other back, okay, now it's your turn, you differentiate. And that continued until you had a mature organ. Okay, so that's another kind of thing. And many examples in developments where cells are communicating with each other and directing each other's final differentiation. That's an important thing. Sometimes cells have to be very close to each other to do that. Local signals, in other words. Other times, cells can secrete things that have a long range effect. Think of steroid hormones. They can affect numerous cells throughout the entire organism's body. Okay, so that's an important kind of thing. Okay, so organizing and limiting the growth of structures, turning them in certain patterns. Why do we have 5 fingers and not 8? Now, by the way, the first tetrapods that transitioned to tetrapods, some of them, which I guess you could class as fish or pre-tetrapods, some of them actually had 8 fingers. But all the modern tetrapods and most of the early fossil ones happen to have 5 fingers. Now, sometimes they're fused together and things like that. But somewhere down the line, a developmental selection was made for having 5 fingers and 5 toes, and those were our ancestors way in the past, some 400 or so million years ago. So somehow a developmental choice was made, and that continued on to this day. But anyway, you have things like that. How come our liver is this big and not that big, like you see in a shark? Okay. So there's all kinds of things, shaping different organs and tissues and things like that, developing structure and form. A lot of this stuff is dependent on cell communication or cell signaling. And that's one of the key things about development. Okay, cells can communicate with each other in numerous different kinds of ways. Many times it's secreted molecules of one kind or another that target cells will be able to pick up, and it will cause changes in behavior, gene expression, whatever the case is. Examples include things like steroid hormones, these proteins known as growth factors. We'll get to those later on. Some of you may remember that from cell biology. And various kinds of things. Some of these secreted molecules operate only over fairly short distance. So cells or tissues have to be physically close to each other. Others go into the bloodstream and the body fluids and stuff like that and can affect cells throughout the entire organism. Think of steroid hormones, that's a good example. Having a global organism-wide effect. So that's one kind of thing. But cells can also communicate by the extracellular matrix, the secreted proteins and polysaccharides they produce. Those can contact other cells and also stimulate differentiation, division, cell movement, what have you. And of course, this is a short-range interaction because the cells have to be very close to each other for the surrounding matrix of one cell to influence nearby cells. They have to be very close to each other. And in other cases, cells have to actually physically come into direct contact with each other. The receptors of one cell type and the membrane binding to membrane receptors in the other cell type, and some kind of signal going back and forth on that. So these are three broad methods of cell signaling. We're going to look at that, of course, after the exam. But this kind of introduces this. This is a critical aspect of development. Many developmental processes are really dependent on cell signaling, often that alters gene expression in one way or another. So that's a good point to leave off, I would say. And I'll see you guys in lab fairly shortly.